This time, I'll call on Leader Grant. You're recognized in debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please recognize Dr. Rudman in debate?
Representative Rudman, you're recognized in debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And so the rep who mentioned KISS and Motley Crue earlier in debate, I'm going to push the envelope a little further, and I'm going to use rock and roll to explain to people why this is such a good bill. So a lot of you know that my son down at Florida Atlantic, he's a rock drummer. And so during the COVID pandemic, they were holding these things called rock and roll fantasy camps. They held it down at the Hard Rock down in Hollywood, Florida. And so my 18-year-old son took his hard-earned money that he had earned from playing gigs, and he signed up for rock and roll fantasy camp right here in Florida for the promise of being able to play a gig at the Hard Rock with members of Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, and Megadeth. After he paid, a couple $1,000, a month or two later, this organization in California calls us. And they say, your son needs to be vaccinated or he can't meet his idols, and he will not be allowed into the event. And of course, this was unexpected. This was not in any of the contract or anything. So I call him back and I say, well, hey, listen, I'm a doctor and we don't really do things that way in Florida. You know, it's a patient's choice. It's individual liberties, individual rights. And the answer I got was, no, you need to decide in an hour whether your son's going to get vaccinated or not, or he can't come. Now, of course, to an 18-year-old who's expecting to meet his childhood idols, you could have told him he needs to hop in his car and drive off a cliff if he wants to meet Dave Mustaine, and he may have done it. So to him, it really wasn't much of a choice. It was really more of a coercion. So for that reason, and for that reason alone, my son chose to get vaccinated. Not because he wanted to, not because a doctor recommended that he get vaccinated, not because he was high risk, but because a business dangled a carrot in front of him, his passion, his dream. And they said, you can't get here unless you make a healthcare decision that we want you to make. Now, the story doesn't end there because he did get vaccinated. And of course, as you know, these COVID vaccines, they're not 100%. So a month before the event, guess who got sick with COVID? The entire Rudman household. So we were then notified of another requirement to enter the camp. It's bad enough he was coerced into making a medical decision he didn't want to make. But now a month before the event, they're like, everyone's going to have to pass a same-day PCR test to be admitted. Otherwise, you're kicked out. As a physician, I called the Rock and Roll Fantasy Camp and tried to explain to them, look, these PCR tests can stay positive for months after the fact. And we were only at that point, we were only about 3 weeks out from our illness. So there was a pretty good likelihood that even though we were recovered and we were fine, we were of no threat, no risk to anyone, there's a pretty good likelihood that we weren't going to pass that test. So we drove the 12 hours down to Boca Raton. We took the same day PCR test. We failed, even though we were perfectly healthy, perfectly fine. We were totally recovered from our illness, and we were sent home. No discussion, no debate, no doctor's note, no listening to a board-certified Florida physician. And so you can imagine how I felt as a father, knowing that a business had coerced my son into getting a vaccine that didn't work. That was life before the executive orders that Representative Griffiths is going to codify into law. That's what the world was like prior to these executive orders and prior to this bill. Now, the story doesn't end there. Let me tell you what life is like now that we have these orders and now that we are going to make them permanent in law. Because after this Hard Rock Fantasy Camp, there was another camp. This was after this body said, no, we don't do things that way in Florida. We do not discriminate. So I called the Hard Rock Fantasy Camp and said, hey, look, we're willing to come back because now you're going to play by Florida law. And guess what? This camp, they used Florida doctors. They used Florida protocols. I met the CEO of Rock and Roll Fantasy Camp, and I asked him, I said, you threw us out of the last one for no good reason. He said, yeah, we threw a lot of people out. He said, whatever protocol we were using was bogus. We threw away like 50% of the people who had paid. We didn't even allow them in. He said, I lost my shirt on that transaction. He said, I was thinking of never hosting another fantasy camp ever again. And I said, well, we're here now and we're playing by Florida rules. This is the last day of camp. How was this camp now that we can't discriminate, now that we did away with the foolish mask policies, now that we did away with the foolish requirement for having to pass a PCR test, now that we just went back to using common sense and asking people, do you feel ill? Do you feel sick? I said, now that you are practicing under Florida protocols, how was this camp? He looked me square in the eye and he said, I've never had a more successful rock camp. And so hopefully, members, that illustrates the difference. I gave you an example of what life was like before this bill, and I gave you an example of what life will be like after this bill. And thank you, Representative Griffiths, for codifying this into law, because we do not want to go back to those days where people were being discriminated against because of their personal, individual health choices. Thank you, Rep.
Leader Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We waive our time in entirety.
Waiving their time in the entirety.